Hello everybody, my name is Evans Quam, the Incident Commander for Great Basin Team 1. We're currently assigned to the Camp Creek fire outside of Sandy, Oregon. Our public information officers have been monitoring a lot of the questions that have been coming in from the public, both as well as on the phone, in person, as well as online. And we've been getting some common questions that I wanted to take a little bit of a time to provide some clarity and context behind what's going on. So some of the questions we've been getting is, how come this fire is taking so long? Another question is, how come the only containment we have on the fire is on the north side? And then the last one is what our basic strategy is and how do we come to that conclusion? I think to best answer some of those questions, it's helpful if we do a little explanation of some basic concepts of fire and also the science of fighting wildland fire. So if you don't mind the illustration, and please forgive the artistry because I am not an artist, but let's just say this is a fire. Depending on the direction that the wind is blowing from, let's just say this wind is blowing from this direction and it's going that way, we have the head of the fire, what we refer to, the heel of the fire, and then also the flanks. And all three burn and interact a little bit differently. So the head of the fire is probably where you see the most amount of speed and intensity because it's being pushed by the wind. And this fire is continued to spread and heat up fuels out ahead of it, and so when it dries those fuels out to the point of ignition, then they ignite, and then it just keeps building on itself. On the flanks of the fire, you do get some lateral spread, but typically speaking, it's not as much. And then the heel of the fire, since the wind is blowing it back into itself, away from the fuels, it's typically not as hot or as intense. So those are some ideas, the concepts to think about and why it occurs. Another concept to think about is, let's just say we're on flat ground and we have some fire or flames. Most of the heat will go upwards and outwards. So we have the convective heating, which is similar to the principle of a hot air balloon where the hot air rises. And then we also have the radiant heat that emanates from the fire, very similar to like a wood stove or even a campfire. The heat that comes out of it, both from the convection as well as the radiation, will preheat the fuels that are adjacent to it. So if we have trees off to either side or vegetation on the ground, radiant heat or the convective heat will dry out the fuels adjacent to it, and then that fire will eventually spread into it once it becomes dry enough to the point of ignition. This is under a no-wind situation on flat ground. So let's say we have the flat ground and we have our fire here, but if we were to have a wind coming from this direction, what happens is the flames end up bending over. So now the distance between this fire to the fuels out ahead of it is a lot less versus this distance here under a no-wind situation. But under a slope situation, we have a hillside and we have the fire right here. This angle is greatly reduced as opposed to, say, the flat ground where this angle or the amount of distance is quite a bit more. So as a result, the radiant heat that's emanating off of this flame will preheat any of the litter on the ground, the logs, the brush, the trees, and then the fire will more readily spread. So that very much explains the growth of this fire. We have multiple drainages out here, the main one being the Bull Run or Camp Creek itself, and then also the Cedar Creek here. So under westerly wind spread, which mostly was the predominant wind when this fire first started on August 24th and burned into the 25th, was not only was the wind coming out of the west, so it pushed it east, but also the direction of the drainages was also in that direction. And when your wind and your valley bottoms or your valleys align, you have what we call alignment, so that the wind blows right up that drainage bottom, and so it kind of funnels the wind, if you will, which is why we probably saw the greatest amount of spread. This is the head fire, as I showed earlier. So this east side of the fire is the head, as I showed earlier, which has the greatest amount of energy, rate of spread. And then the flanks of the fire is what we're dealing with on the north side as well as the south side. This is the 12 road for reference. This is the 14 road within the watershed. And back here is the heel. So the coolest part of the fire is typically here, the flanks. They're still hot, but not as hot as the head. And then the head, of course, has got the most amount of energy, probably the greatest rate of spread. So when we were first assigned to the fire, we were looking at the various options, and given the weather that we had back then, our best strategy we figured was to try to use the road networks that were on both on the north side as well as the south side to try to contain the fire inside that road network. And we have a variety of methods of doing so. So the two primary tactics that we like to employ is either direct attack or indirect attack. We use direct attack anytime the conditions are safe enough to put firefighters up close to the fire, because as the name implies, direct attack is we will establish an anchor point, usually at the heel of the fire where it's the coolest, which is also the safest part of the fire, and we will construct some sort of fire line directly right up against the edge of the fire as close as possible. And the idea there is to minimize the amount of potential the fire can spread, and we do so by constructing a fire line down to mineral soil, in other words, something that won't burn. Or if we have a roadway that's right in the area, great, we don't have to construct anything, we'll just use the pre-existing roadway. There's a lot of hazards associated with going direct, and sometimes those hazards can be mitigated. So if the fire's burning very hot, because the winds are blowing, or the heavy fuels, we can use our aircraft to drop water or even retardant on those hot sections of the line, reduce the intensities to allow the ground crews, hand crews or engines or mechanized equipment, to get in close to establish that line. So that's one hazard that we run into with how hot the fire is, because the potential for burnovers and injury to firefighters. Another hazard, and it's very, very, very prevalent on this fire, has been all the not only the snags, in other words, the dead trees, or even sometimes it doesn't have to be a dead tree, it could just be a dead branch that's up in the tree that a lot of the folks in the logging community will call widowmakers. Or we also have some tree species out there that are very prone to, once the roots burn out, they might be a completely green tree, still somewhat alive, it'll just fall over quite suddenly without a whole lot of warning. So those present a lot of hazards. And then whenever we're on steep slopes, we have the potential for gravity to come into play, where as the fire burns through, it burns the vegetation, which may be holding a large log or rocks or boulders, and when those large objects dislodge, they start rolling down the hill with gravity, and sometimes they dislodge other items, which can then turn into a cascading series of objects that are rolling down the hill, and most of those things have a tendency to injure firefighters. So the safety of firefighters is very much our concern. So if we run into a situation where the fire is too hot that we can't tone down the fire behavior in order to get close, or we have snags and other aerial hazards from above, or we're on very steep ground where we're concerned about rolling rocks and rolling logs and even rolling firefighters, at that point then we do what we call indirect attack, where we either construct a fire control line, such as a dozer line or a hand crew line, or we use an existing roadway that is farther away from the fire, so that any of the hazards that are right in this general area, like say a snag, if the snag were to fall over, it's far enough away from the control line, and so for the most part, we stay a little bit safer, or it gives us enough time or distance away from the potential for being burned over, or other types of hazards out there. So really what it comes down to is a principle that we call risk management. And I also want to touch a little bit on what we mean by risk management. So risk, by definition, or a very common definition, is generally thought of as the probabilities and consequence. So in other words, what is the likelihood of something bad happening to something that we care about? Human life, or it could also be property, it could be values, basically things that we don't want to see damaged or burned up, or a life-threatening injury. So as we go through our assessment, we were looking for what are hazards are present. We've already talked about the snags, we've already talked about the steep slopes and the chance of rolling material coming down. We've also talked about fire impingement or fire burning over firefighters. So we look at ways to mitigate those hazards. And if we can mitigate those hazards, then perfect. We can continue on with that mission, be it indirect or direct. But if we come across a hazard that is very difficult for us to mitigate, then at that point, the likelihood of that bad thing happening is very high. And if the consequence, or another severity of the injury to the firefighter is also very high, that's pretty much a, we think of that as an extremely high risk, and it's not something we're prepared to do. Because every single firefighter out there is somebody's brother, sister, uncle, father, daughter, so on and so forth. Human life is precious to us. And unfortunately, in our profession, approximately 18, 19 wildland firefighters die every year. Those fatalities cover a wide range of causes, everything from heart attacks to burnovers, but a big component of our fatality statistics come from firefighters get hit by hazards, such as rolling rocks, rolling logs, or hazard trees, widowmakers, that type of thing. And it's just not something that we're prepared to accept undue amount of risk. We accept the fact that fighting fire is an inherently dangerous occupation, just like we have a lot of very dangerous occupations out there. But we're prepared to accept the risk as long as we can provide adequate mitigation, and the people that are engaged in those operations feel comfortable and safe. If you've ever worked in a profession where you've had to send people into harm's way, knowing and with, you want to have a good appreciation for what the risks are, as well as also what are we trying to save. If you've ever been in that position, be it warfare, combat, law enforcement, emergency response, firefighters running into a burning building to save people's lives, I think you'll have a better appreciation for some of the things that, frankly, keep me awake over the course of my entire career, because I have had to deal with this in the past. So for us, risk is what is the likelihood of something bad happening, and if it does happen, how bad is it? To date, we've had 3 fairly serious injuries occur. In fact, all 3 of them were due to, 2 of them were due to hazard trees, and the third one was due to a very large rock. Fortunately, all 3 of those individuals they're okay. One's going to require surgery. The other one's arm's in a cast, and they're probably going to be in a cast for quite some time. And the third one is just has a lot of bruises and contusions, but that individual's okay. But the likelihood keeps going up. The longer we're on this fire, the more people we bring out there into that environment with those hazards, unless we can figure out a way to mitigate all 3 of those things. So that risk component is probably pretty important for everybody to understand, because it really factored in very heavily into our how we selected the current strategy. The other risk factor we also take into account is what is the risk to all the values, what we consider values. And the values are everything from human life, people's property, private land, their livelihood, the watershed itself, and the future of the water quality for this area. So those are also things that we take into account as well, and we try to balance the risk to firefighters against the values that we're trying to save on all sides of the fire. But I think we can all agree that the type of things that are worth a firefighter losing their life over, they have to be pretty high value. And to borrow something from our structured firefighting brethren is, they say you risk a little to save a little, or you risk a lot to save a lot. In other words, if there's people trapped in a burning building, absolutely, no question about it, firefighters will go in there, even though it's probably a very hazardous, high-risk operation, but it's part of our creed to save and protect human life. In the wildland sense, we have some room and time and distance on our side, so we don't have to force the firefighters to get themselves into a high-risk operation. Another thing that we're also dealing with is the direction from land management agencies we are working for. They place a high priority on us not engaging firefighters in high-risk operations when there's a low probability of success. So high risk that somebody's going to get injured, low likelihood that that whatever they're doing is going to be successful on saving things. So that is not, again, not something we want to do. Ideally speaking, we want to do the least amount of risk to save the values. And the least amount of risk we can subject the firefighters to, the better. However, I also recognize that this is not a zero-sum game here, where if I reduce the risk to the firefighters, what happens to the risk to the public? The fire would get potentially bigger, more smoke, longer duration, more impact on people's livelihoods. So we're very cognizant that this fire presents not only a risk to the firefighters, but also a risk to all the folks that live in the surrounding area, as well as the future water quality for everybody that pulls water out of the municipal watershed. So for us, it's a matter of taking all these factors, the risk to the responders, risk to the values at risk that we're concerned about, and factoring all that in into coming up with the best possible strategy that we can come up with. And it's a fairly complex process because there's a lot of variables, a lot of inputs. It's not a straightforward mathematical process where you input numbers and out spits an answer on the other end. A lot of it has to do with, we just have to have a good appreciation for what the risks are. And as I said before, we're very aware of the risks that this fire poses to a lot of the folks down here on the Highway 26 area, the folks up in here in Multnomah County, and the folks who are here in Sandy, as well as everybody that pulls water out of this, or drinks the water that comes out of the watershed. So all that is being factored into our decision-making process. So let's get to the strategy. So as I mentioned before, there was a lot of hazards in certain parts of the fire that we could not mitigate in order to be able to go direct. If we could go direct, we would prefer to go direct because there are some ways to provide for firefighter safety. It reduces the likelihood of getting burned over because if you have to escape from the fire, you just step into the previously burned area. We found an opportunity on the northeast flank of the fire, from the 12 road down into the Cedar Creek, the Camp Creek drainage, using a short road spur, some hand line, and then also tying into the 1210 road on this side. And this is where you're going to see some increase in containment this evening. We've been successful in holding the fire there. We're able to use a combination of mechanical equipment to widen out the road, remove any of the hazard trees. And we also got a lot of the professional falling teams out there to take down some of the snags that were too big for the equipment. And then we also punched some hand line in some places to connect the two road systems together. Because we were able to mitigate the snag hazards, and the terrain in this particular part of the fire is not very steep, so we didn't have the rolling hazards of the large rolling rocks or the rolling logs. Again, we were able to go direct. That did not come around until it started to rain. It's been several days ago now, but that first bit of rain when we got about half an inch of rain. That opportunity did not present itself until we got that rainfall. But prior to that, we looked at the road network and said, okay, this looks like our best opportunity to stop the fire on the north side, and the 14 road on the south side, that looks like our best opportunity. But because of the snag hazards, because of the steepness of the slope, we ultimately determined that indirect, as I shown over here, indirect, staying a fair distance away from the main fire, was our best likelihood with the highest probability of success and the lowest risk to responders. So what I wanted to do is draw your attention to the whiteboard where I've sketched out, and again, I apologize for I'm a firefighter, not an artist. I've sketched out two situations. This is the north flank where the 12 road is, where we have the fire uphill of the road, and we have unburned fuels between the main fire and the actual roadway, which we plan on using as our indirect control line and stopping the fire there. And then also the 14 road, which is the opposite. This is where the road is fairly high up on the ridge, and then down a steep slope, then you have the main fire downhill below it. And as you can see on the map, that would be this section here where we have not brought the main fire out to the road yet, as well as here, and then the 12 road system, that is this situation where the road is below the main fire. So, main fire up the hill, this distance could be anywhere from quarter to a half mile or even 100 yards at some locations, but we have the road network here. What we have done to date is we we used both hand crews and mechanized equipment to remove some of the smaller trees, the fuels. We've even taken out some of the larger trees, masticated this area to try to reduce the fuel loading in there, with the intent of, at some point, we would then burn all this vegetation between the road and the main fire. In fact, we've already accomplished some of that. That occurred before the rainstorms, and that's where we have about that 1 mile of 12 road secured. So what the crews did was we ignited small little fires up the hill, and we allowed those fires to burn up the hill and connect themselves to the main fire. And we did it in short little segments in order to keep the intensity down. And then over time, over the course of several days, we just continued to light successive amounts of fire until we brought it all the way down to the road. And thanks to all the prep work that we did, remove the fuels and vegetation right inside the road, this intensity of this fire was fairly low, so we reduced the potential for this tree to catch on fire all the way to the top and then throw embers up and over the line. Now, we call that spotting, and we were trying to do our best to avoid the spotting potential. It took a little bit of time for us to do the prep work up against the road, the fuels reduction, but ultimately, like I mentioned, the firefighters in this area several days ago before the rains hit, they were able to burn that out, and then we spent probably 2 or 3 days mopping that up. In other words, extinguishing everything in about as far in as we could reach off the roadways. But the advantage of having the roadways there is then we can bring the engines and the water tenders, deploy hose, set up tanks, and spray water in this area, get in there with the hand tools, grub it up, and extinguish everything, roll over the burning logs, extinguish underneath it. Very similar to what you would do when you put out a campfire completely, except just on a much larger scale. That has taken us some time, and then the rains came in, and unfortunately what that has done is the remaining sections that we have yet to burn out on the north flank on the 12 road, the fuels are just a little bit too damp. Every day that we have drying, we'll go out and we do what we call a test burn, where they'll deliberately ignite something interior to see how it's burning. Up till now, it's been too damp, and we weren't getting the right results. What we end up getting was what we call a ratty burn, or a very incomplete burn, where not everything cleaned up, and there was a lot of unburned pockets, which ultimately would cause reburn potential down the road if and when it got hot and dry again. So we're looking for the right conditions in order to finish the firing operations along the 12 road, so we can complete all of this, extend that containment all the way to this corner where we have the direct hand line. And so basically this unburned area between the main road and the main fire, all that's going to get burned up. I mean, just looking at the map, I'd say that's probably about 200-300 acres. Shouldn't take us that long once we get the right conditions, and then after we mop it up for several days, we'll be able to call that section contained. So that helps explain why this has been taking a number of days. We had the right conditions before the rains. We were prepared to continue firing. Unfortunately, when the rains occurred, it put us on pause for a little bit. And then, of course, last night, we received another 0.2 of an inch of rain up there, so that probably just pushed us even further back. Initially, I was hoping that maybe we should be able to start burning today or tomorrow, but now we're probably looking at sometime Wednesday, Thursday, before the fuels are dry enough on the fire for us to resume and complete our firing operations to button up the north flank. Let's talk about the south flank now, over here off the 14 road. So as I mentioned before, the situation is opposite of what the 12 road is. The road is up on top. We have heavy timbered fuels on the steeper hillside going down, and this is fairly steep hillside. I mean, it's about 80% slope. So for every 100 feet of horizontal distance, it goes up 80 feet. So it's almost a 45-degree angle. So fairly steep. We have fire down below the main road. And in order for us to contain this indirect portion of the fire using the 14 road, we have to do something with this fuels between the road, our control line, and the main fire. So similar to what we were doing over on the 12 road, any of the smaller trees in the area, those got removed with hand crews or masticators. We've also been using some feller bunchers to take out some of the larger trees, and essentially what we wanted to do is just make this road prism as defensible as possible, because now we have fire approaching from the downhill side. And remember some of the drawings I showed you earlier, fire likes to run uphill. a lot faster than it does downhill, because the flames are closer to the fuels out ahead of it that it's pre-treating. So in this particular situation, once we do get the window to ignite, instead of lighting it at the bottom up against the main fire, and the main fire will run up the hill probably too aggressively, we're going to start up here and get some fire going, and we're going to burn the ground fields just inside the main road network. Once we build a little bit of a buffer, we'll light some more, and that'll let that clean up and cool off, and then take another little strip, so on and so forth, all the way until we bring our firing operations down to the road. We have a number of tools that we use. Firefighters have ignition devices. It dribbles a little bit of gasoline diesel mixture on the ground, and we use that to ignite. Or we could shoot essentially flares. It looks like a Very pistol. So standing on the road, you could shoot it down into here. It'll go several hundred feet. And then we also brought in a uncrewed aerial system, or a UAS or drone. But it's not the typical hobby drone that you could buy at the store. It's about a 6-foot diameter with a payload capacity of about 45 pounds. And it will carries a device that drops incendiary devices out there, so we could ignite fuels farther out rather than put firefighters down on that steep hillside where they're subject to the rolling hazards, the snags, and whatnot. So primarily we'll be working off the roadways to burn that out. We do have one section of the line that connects the 14 road with the 12 road, which is a hand line, because we didn't want to give up too much ground. So we'll have firefighters positioned on that hand line, using the drip torches to ignite fire on the ground, or shooting the Very pistols interior. And then beyond their reach, then we can bring in the UAS drone to drop the incendiary devices. So that's kind of a summation of the two sides that we're dealing with, on the north side and the south side. Again, on the south side, we're in a holding pattern, waiting for the fuels to dry out. I'm hoping by Wednesday or Thursday we should be able to resume firing operations. So again, we need to burn out this pocket, this pocket, this pocket inside the roads, bring the fire downhill from the road to the main fire. Once we have it cooled off, we'll have all the engines and water tenders working off the roadway to mop up and secure all the fire that we introduced. And after a period of several days, once it cools off sufficiently that we're confident that it won't jump the lines, at that point we'll be able to show those areas, additional areas, as contained. So, as part of a lot of our contingency planning, because there are no 100% guarantees in this business, we feel pretty confident that we have the right weather conditions once it dries out, and we have the right mix of resources. We feel like this is a fairly high probability of success, but I can't give you a number, and I won't give you a number. I'll just say it's moderate to high likelihood that we'll be successful in keeping the fire inside the 14 road network, keep it from going south. However, in the event that we're not successful, which is, it's a lower probability right now, but that could change later on in the season after we get more warming and drying. And if we ever get a northerly wind event, northwest wind would push the fire this way, or northeast wind would push the fire this way, then we're also opening up some of these roads from the old logging roads that are out there, to use them either as additional contingency lines, or what we call alternate lines, secondary lines, or for us to get access into areas where, in case a spot fire comes out of the main interior and goes over the road, to give us more access. And then we also have a series of other contingencies identified that, in the event that the fire starts to give us problems, then we will start working with our partners, with the Oregon Department of Forestry, the BLM land managers down here, Clackamas Fire, Oregon State Fire Marshals, to put in another contingency line to stop the fire. But we're only going to do that if we need to, because the amount of impact and damage that we would create from putting that line in, it's significant, and it's also it requires a lot of resources. So that's kind of a quick summation recap. I hope I've answered a lot of the main questions that we've been receiving. I believe we're going to be having another community meeting that'll be streamed live on Facebook on September 6th, Wednesday. We're going to be at Welch's at the Lions Club. You're more than welcome to attend or join us online. And as always, our PIO shop is monitoring all the online questions, as well as any phone calls that we're getting on the information number. And then we also have a series of pop-ups scattered around the area that we're more than open to fielding your questions and doing our best to provide you with answers. So with that, thank you very much for your time.